You are listening to the Vincast, Australia's premier podcast dedicated to the world of wine. The podcast lives and breathes off its feedback, and one of the reasons that I've continued it for so long is because I've really appreciated hearing from listeners who have told me what they like about the show, particular guests they might have enjoyed hearing about. So I really do encourage everyone, if you do listen to the podcast on a regular basis and you enjoy it, please do get in touch with me to let me know and maybe make some suggestions about how you might think I should change the show. You can do that via email. You can get me at thevincast@gmail.com. You can head to my website, intrepidwino.com. There's a contact page there. But also, I'd love to hear from you via the iTunes page for the podcast. You can leave a 5-star rating if you feel it deserves it, and leave a review, which is not just good feedback for myself, but also for potential listeners and for potential guests. Thank you to everyone for all your support, and I hope you enjoy this week's episode. On episode 113 of the Vincast, I chat with Fiona Donald, 20-year veteran of the Australian wine industry and head winemaker at Seppeltsfield in the Barossa Valley. Hello there, Vincasters. Welcome to another episode of the Vincast Wine Podcast. My name is James Guestbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. We are rapidly approaching the end of the year, the festive season. The weather hopefully seems to be improving, at least here in Melbourne. Time to be opening lots of beautiful wines, white wines, sparkling wines, any kind of wine you enjoy at this time of year. But I hope you have been enjoying the podcast of late. I know that it's been great to have some really amazing guests on the show, and this week's guest is no exception. Fiona Donald graduated from Roseworthy College in the early 1990s and has had an incredible winemaking career working for some very historic wine producers in some of the most important wine regions in Australia. And for the past 5 or 6 years, she has been working at the helm of Seppeltsfield, the arguably the most historic wine producer in the Barossa Valley in South Australia. And I caught up with her recently at a wonderful tasting looking at some beautiful old fortified wines. And we sat down and had a chat about her background and how important Seppeltsfield is. I hope you enjoy our chat. Please stick around to the end so you can find out how to get in touch with both of us. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Fiona, here we are in the incredible cellars underneath the old Dan Murphy store here in Prahran, and you are my guest on the Vincast. Welcome. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, James. Nice to be here.
Fiona, I typically start every episode of my podcast by asking my guest if they can remember the first interaction they had with wine that made them think about it in a different way, and that kind of set them on the path to working in the wine industry.
Well, I grew up in suburban Sydney, and really my first memories of wine are really, the bottle of Horton White Burgundy in the fridge. So
classic.
Mum and Dad enjoyed a bottle of, bottle of wine, but weren't necessarily, really into wine or wine collectors particularly.
But they enjoyed wine. They drank wine fairly regularly at home.
Had dinner parties.
Yep.
A bottle of wine. Hunter River, Shiraz, Horton White Burgundy, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So really my own first interaction with wine was really as a high school student who was doing science subjects but also doing home economics. I had an interest in food technology. That's where it all started.
Right.
But I actually read an article in a magazine about a family wine business in the Yarra Valley called Wanturna Estate. And that was the first moment where I had some inkling or thought that perhaps this business of making wine might be more interesting than food technology.
What was it about the article or the
It was a
Wanturna
father and daughter
estate?
story.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so it was about Mary Ann.
Were you close with your dad
And
growing up?
Yeah, look, I was close to both my parents. I think it was just more that sense of, it's late 80s. I went to an all-girls school.
Okay.
Girls can do anything
Right.
of thing.
Okay.
That probably captured my imagination initially. And then in the article there were aspects of the article around, the science and art of winemaking.
Sure.
Which captured my imagination.
And that was where you sort of thought about how you might kind of head into that career path?
Well, that's right. I remember going out to Mum in the kitchen and saying, "Oh, I've just read this really interesting article, and it's about winemaking, Yarra Valley, and it's father and daughter, and it just sounds really interesting." And Mum said, "Oh, winemaking. Don't really know anything about winemaking, or where would you study it, or how do you learn it?" And we were really, had no idea.
Right.
And I remember Mum saying, as an avid reader of the Australian Women's Weekly, "Oh, there's a fellow in the magazine with a column who writes about, life and wine.
Mm-hmm.
I'll look that up." And it was Len Evans.
There you go.
So, well, we really had not much of a clue who he was.
Sure.
But I sat down as a 17-year-old and wrote him a letter.
Really? What's saying?
Dear Mr. Evans, my name is, I'm in Year 12 at. I've just read this article. It was very, a letter of a teenager, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think this is interesting. I don't know where to start. You write a column in the Australian Women's Weekly, blah, blah, blah. So then he didn't write back to me, but he rang me.
Wow.
So I remember, again, my mum answered the phone and came and found me and said, "Someone's on the phone for you. It's Len Evans." And, so I remember saying, "Hello, Fiona speaking. Evans here." And he just, commended me for putting pen to paper and writing a letter.
Yeah.
But also that's where he advised me that if you wanted to study winemaking in Australia at that time, you went to Roseworthy College.
Of course.
In South Australia.
Yep.
So I had to write another letter to Roseworthy.
Yep.
Could I please have all your admissions information about your enology? I didn't really know how to say it, but your enology course. And that all came by post. It was before the days of Googling. And so in the end, I applied to Roseworthy College for winemaking, Sydney University for science, got into both, and then made the big life-changing decision.
If you hadn't gone into wine, would you have followed a career in science, do you think?
Well, I would have gone to Sydney University and done science and maybe moved down a food technology path.
Fair enough.
I might have found wine in the end.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But it's like a sliding doors story, isn't it, really? But, Mum and Dad were fully supportive, back going down to South Australia from the wilds of suburban Sydney. And so the following late January, driven down to Roseworthy with my suitcase and my cassette deck and and started at Roseworthy in 1988. So
was winemaking, as far as study, was that gaining popularity at that time? Were there a growing number of students at Roseworthy?
Well, I can only answer that by saying the year before us, I think, had 8 people in it.
Right.
8 or 10, and our year had 22.
Yeah, okay.
So, but really, I realised, I look back now, how naive I was. I had no idea about, that was the end of the 1980s and all the angst and the grief of the vine pool, especially in the Barossa, which is, of course, Roseworthy's near the Barossa. Had no idea what the industry had gone through.
So this was like just before the rather large boom of the 90s?
Yeah, absolutely. And so all of us who studied at that time, and most of us graduated, walked out into jobs.
Yeah.
So again, looking back, just how fortunate we were to really sort of catch that wave of the boom of the 90s.
Sure.
And pretty much our whole group that went through together walked into a job that they wanted.
Was there any particular aspect of studies at Roseworthy that really appealed to you? Did you connect with any particular part, whether it was the science side of things, or did you get an interest in viticulture?
So certainly, tasting was completely new to me, to taste in that way and be taught how to taste wine. Given I've killed every pot plant I've ever owned, viticulture was a revelation, just how vines, grow and the new wood each year and pruning. I had Peter Dry as a lecturer, fantastic lecturer. I listened to him present at the recent Wine Industry Tech Conference this year, and it was just like being back, listening to a Peter Dry lecture.
Yeah.
Just so informative and engaging.
Yeah.
So I'd really only thought about winemaking. I hadn't thought about viticulture, but of course, that's where it all starts, quality grapes.
Yeah.
Really, the whole course was the whole course was fantastic. Wine chemistry is fascinating.
Was that sort of where the industry was heading at the time, where they needed, more qualified winemakers rather than viticulturists?
Well, when I did the course, it was a winemaking course with some viticulture subjects.
Right.
A couple of years later, they actually split the degree.
And now they've been, at least at University of Adelaide, they've been joined back together now, apparently.
Oh, have they? No,
Yeah.
I'm not aware of that. But certainly for a long period of time, it was a separate degree, if that's what you chose to do.
So you were able to do some viticulture studies as well?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was your first job in the industry?
My first job was in 1990, and I was a vintage cellar hand at Thomas Hardy and Sons down at Tintara in McLaren Vale.
Yeah, beautiful winery.
A fantastic winery, and that was before. I mean, it's awesome now because they've done so much, capital expenditure on the open fermenter area.
Yeah.
But back when I worked there, it was the original concrete fermenters with the waxed wooden headboards.
Heaven. I love concrete.
Yeah.
Sorry. Part of the reason why I love Seppeltsfield so much. And so was it a pretty challenging experience?
It was challenging.
Going straight in?
Challenging, eye-opening.
Forgive me for saying this, but a fairly male-dominated environment?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yep. So, but everyone worked in pairs.
All right.
So you were working with someone else and, got taught how to set up a pump and, you suction your delivery and how to pump things over and take samples and temperatures and, a wide range of winemaking and cellar activities.
Yeah.
And so then after that vintage, obviously went back and finished third year at Roseworthy. And then late that year, Thomas Hardy and Sons advertised for an operational winemaker down at Tintara.
Right.
So I threw my hat in the ring, and I was fortunate enough to be successful in getting that role. So I went back in 1991 as operational winemaker.
With that facility, were you looking at fruit and then subsequently wine from a lot of different sites and potentially different regions as well?
Back then, for that site, for that company, it was mainly McLaren Vale.
Right.
A little bit of Clare would come down.
Okay.
And then fruit would come up from the big Pathway vineyard that Hardy's had down there.
Yeah.
But it was mostly getting to know McLaren Vale and all the sub-regions of McLaren Vale.
The rare earth.
Rare earth, yes. So, from all the beautiful contour-type vineyards around the old Seaview winery to, Blewett Spring Sands, and then, blocks down closer to the coast. So
Right.
My boss at the time, David O'Leary, who's now, O'Leary
Walker.
Wines up in Clare, right back then it was about going out to the vineyard, looking, tasting, monitoring the flavour development alongside the Beaumay and making the call and how you're going to split the vineyard and, whether it went into one of the bigger tanks or whether it went across 4 open fermenters or whatever.
How long did you end up working at the Tintara facility?
So I did, if you include 1990 as a cellar hand, I did 3 vintages there as operational winemaker.
Mm-hmm.
And then during that time, so this really speaks to probably what was happening in the industry. Companies were starting to merge.
Okay.
And so that's when BRL Hardy was formed.
Right.
So when Hardy's merged with Berry Romano.
Yes.
So in the middle of 1993, they said, chief winemaker and my boss, you're doing quite a good job. We're going to send you up to the Riverland to be red winemaker at Romano.
Right, okay. So that was a pretty reasonable sea change to go.
It was. So I went from a winery,
the beach to the
exactly
irrigated river.
Yeah. So went from a winery that did about 5,000 tonnes to a winery that did 20.
Right.
So Berry was actually, that's the really large winery. Romano was, big, but about 20,000 tonnes.
Yep.
So then I worked there. The white winemaker was a woman called Anne-Marie Wosley. So you had this 20,000 tonne winery in the Riverland with two winemakers who happened to be female.
Wow.
So, yeah.
At that point, had you started to develop any particular interest in regionality or particular varieties? Or were you still fairly open-minded and just tasting as much as you could and finding, what you could?
Still, tasting as much as you could, but really, I was really firmly a winemaker of Shiraz. That's really where my first 2 jobs had taken me.
And you had a passion for old vine?
I think Yes, but in the end, old vine doesn't guarantee quality.
Okay.
So it really comes down to the quality of the cultural practices, the management, and really, the biggest unknown of all, the season.
Yeah.
What it throws at you. Yep.
So with the facility up in the Riverland, was a fair amount of bulk wine, or were we talking cask wine type stuff, or
We had reasonably small fermenters for that part of the world. We had, I think, 30 ton static fermenters. So
Okay.
that's when the Chairman's Selection wine label was, in its heyday.
Okay.
So that we had a Cabernet and a Shiraz that went to bottle, and then a lot of the wine found its way into, bulk containers for Europe or
Right. Okay. So
cask
it's
wine.
exporting in bulk. Yeah.
Yep.
That must have been interesting to go from a mid-sized facility to a fairly large facility.
It was, but you learn a lot of good lessons in a big facility.
What are the kind of the bigger challenges in that larger facility?
I think it's the site's bigger for starters, but just planning and being organised and communicating with the staff and being very clear about what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And, just making sure you've got systems so that nothing falls through the cracks.
Sure.
If something needs to go into the laboratory for analysis, it does, and then you follow that analysis up and do what you have to do for every batch, every day.
Yeah.
So it's just good discipline.
Were you get an opportunity to do much travel at that point? Were you heading out to any other regions in Australia or perhaps overseas?
Probably my real eye-opener was when I was at Roseworthy, because you were right near Clare, Barossa, McLarenvale, so I got to know those regions fairly well.
And with some of the people you were studying with, had they come from wine family backgrounds? Did you get the opportunity to taste wines with them, some older stuff as well?
Actually, most of my contemporaries at Roseworthy weren't from winemaking families.
Right, okay.
Yeah, they're people who had an interest or had done a bit of pruning because they live near, an area with vines, or, their dad was an avid collector.
Right, okay.
Other reasons. Yeah.
Yep. And how long did you end up in the Riverland?
So I was up there for 2 years.
Okay.
And then in October of 1995, I was successful in getting the job at Barossa Valley Estate.
BVE.
When it was still down at Anglevale.
Mm-hmm.
So Colin Glaetzer had left BVE to go and start his own company.
Yep.
Up in the Barossa Vintners, and I had applied for that job. I'm successful in getting that.
Yep.
So my boss at the time was Gunter Prass, who had semi-retired and then came out of semi-retirement to help manage the co-op effectively, which was Barossa Valley Estate. So it was amazing to work with him.
Yeah. This was the first entry into the Barossa region for you.
Yep.
And Barossa Valley Estate was a fairly unique entity in Australian terms, because as a cooperative, it's a very common thing in Europe where you have grower members who are providing fruit to the facility to make it into that brand. And they're effectively employing people to run the winery. Was that pretty interesting, working with all the different grower members?
It was the best introduction to the Barossa, in terms of there were still 65 shareholders in Barossa Valley Estate at that point, and it was the best introduction, to gain that understanding of the Barossa's history. These families were fifth, sixth generation, and a typical Barossa story in terms of escaping religious persecution in Europe to come to Australia and end up in the Barossa. A lot of these people were their farms were mixed, so they did other things apart from grapes, and that was their their heritage and their culture. So you could bake bread and put meat on the table and that sort of thing. And so I still know many of those people today, and they're still growing grapes, or either their sons or their daughters or grandsons or granddaughters are now running those same blocks. And
that is sort of one of the really unique things about the Barossa, is that you have that grower, wine company kind of separation. Historically, you don't really find that as much in other Australian regions. That must be really interesting to sort of be looking at these, possibly in some cases, very small parcels and historic parcels as well. I'm sure working for Barossa Valley Estate, you would have had some, particularly that would have really fed your love of Shiraz, I'm sure.
Yeah, we had access to some beautiful fruit from, gnarly old vines, and so obviously BVE was a co-op, so it was all growers.
Yeah.
But after I did a couple of years at BVE, and then I moved to Penfolds,
Okay.
and so that was another ramp up, if you like, because in the Barossa they had company vineyards. Obviously, the famous vineyards, like Kalimna and Canunga Hill,
Yep.
but still a large portfolio of growers.
Yep.
So a lot of small batches, a lot of colour and movement, a lot of interests, a lot of interesting, parcels of fruit, a lot of, different approaches to growing quality grapes. So quite a patchwork.
And a really exciting time as well, those mid-90s where everything seemed possible and, fruit prices were fantastic. Everyone was making good money.
Yeah, and we had some fantastic vintage. I mean, 96 was terrific vintage. 98 was a very ripe, robust vintage, but, some really terrific wines still.
I managed to secure some bin 389 96, right. And God, it was still looking good. Yeah. 20 years later.
Yeah, and in 99 as well, a bit of a sleeper year, but those wines have aged beautifully as well.
Yeah. How long did you end up at Penfolds?
So I ended up working there for about 10 years.
Really? Okay. So were you working under John Duval and then?
Yes, so John was the chief winemaker.
Yep, and then Peter?
And then Peter was group enologist.
Right.
And then he moved into the chief winemaker role.
Mm. And really, two of Australia's finest, certainly Shiraz winemakers, it must have been a pretty amazing experience to work with such a great team.
Oh, the whole Penfolds way of doing things is an amazing experience to be part of that. Mm-hmm. So from how we assessed the blocks of fruit, how we made the decision to harvest, how we scheduled that in, which parcels of fruit went to the different size fermenters, what we did in the morning in terms of Beaumet tasting, what we did in the afternoon in terms of press red and rack red tastings.
Yeah.
Always tasting, always checking, classifying, making sure we had each parcel of wine in its right classification.
Yeah.
And then, of course, come late May, June, the big classification tasting, which was, terrific. And you'd have people like John Bird would come back and do a couple of days. So you're drawing on all this wonderful experience, the depth of experience in that brand.
Mm. And no doubt, I suppose, obviously with BVE it was part of the nature of the business, but with Penfolds, having that close relationship with the growers must be. I know that if memory serves me, they do something really special for they're really serious growers where fruit's going into Grange, for example.
That's right. They have a growers Grange group, and the way they celebrate those growers who've grown the fruit that make it into Grange is an annual lunch down at McGill Estate.
Right, yeah.
And it's really
my memory has served me well.
It has indeed, and it's a real honour. I mean, I visited Karina Wright recently at Oliver's Tauranga.
Sure.
And in her cellar drawer up on the wall is all the photos of all the years where fruit from that block has made Grange.
Yeah.
And the sense of pride is fantastic. For her and for her uncle Don, who grows the grapes.
Yeah.
The sense of pride is just palpable.
Was working within... Did you have a particular area of focus when you were working with Penfolds?
So I was a senior red winemaker, so I worked with all the red winemaking team.
Wow.
Yeah, I actually had two roles when I was with that company. I also during that time got married and I have two children. And so while my children were young, I actually went to another role, which was winemaker vineyard liaison.
Right.
So instead of just being involved with the vineyards at vintage and the prior to harvest decision, it was all year round. Visit our growers with our grower services team and just gain more insight and understanding to the vineyards we were sourcing from, people's pruning, talking about the weather, disease pressure, their water resource, etc., etc., etc. So that was a good couple of years as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was next after Penfolds?
So a little bit of time off. We actually went overseas for a year. My husband had a job in Austria.
Oh, wow.
For a year, which was interesting. We were living in Burgenland in Austria.
Nice.
And, we did a bit of travelling, side trips, skiing and, took kids to London and that sort of thing.
Did you take the opportunity to, taste some more European wines and particularly Austrian wines?
We did. We probably mainly it wasn't as easy as you might think to go and buy other European wines because when you were in Austria, in Burgenland, then it was all there. Mm. They drank their own region's wines.
Lots of Blaufränkisch.
Blaufränkisch and Zweigelt.
Yes.
The beautiful sweet wines from Rust,
Yes.
around Lake Neusiedlersee. So that was an interesting year.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't working, but I'd, someone's going to the winery and taste with Matt, but the kids were, they were still little. And then came home and worked back for a couple of years with Constellation Hardy's.
Right, okay.
But then the opportunity for Seppeltsfield knocked on the door.
Yes. So, obviously, a location and a brand with a certain amount of history.
Yes.
Obviously started by the Seppelts family.
The Seppelt family in 1851.
Yes.
Yep.
What was it like, kind of stepping into that role, into somewhere that is so intrinsically linked to Australian wine history and Barossa history?
Oh, it's an honour, and really, I think pretty much all of us who work there feel like we're custodians.
Yeah.
So you're looking after what's there. Hopefully, you leave it a little better than you found it. That sort of thought process. But the sense of history is, again, it's palpable. It's there, and even just from working in a winery that was built in 1888.
Yeah.
To our fantastic staff in Cellar Door who do the daily heritage tour, and you hear them telling that the fabulous Seppelt family history, over and over again with the same level of detail and passion for that story.
Because one of the added levels of heritage with a winery like Seppeltsfield, it's not just about the viticultural heritage in terms of the age of the vines and those beautiful old sites. It's not just in terms of the infrastructure of the buildings and the equipment and stuff like that, but it's also the vinous heritage. When you have wine in the cellars, which has been there for 100 years,
absolutely, we had the longest.
You very much are a custodian of that kind. You have to be respectful of all of the people who made the wines.
Absolutely.
In 100 vintages going back.
So we had the longest unbroken line of year-dated tawny in the world, with the first vintage being 1878. So there's definitely older wines in the world, but our claim is the longest unbroken line of year-dated tawnies in the world. So, the 2016 went to wood in May.
Yeah.
And you just follow the lineage from 1878 and you'll find the 2016.
So when you started at Seppeltsfield, was that kind of when Warren Randall bought Seppeltsfield, and so you were brought in to work with a team to kind of revitalise, rejuvenate the brand and the estate?
Yeah, that's correct. Warren gave me a ring one day, and sort of out of the blue, and I had known him from previous interactions in the past when I was at Penfolds, and it really was a call out of the blue. And when someone says, "Oh, I'm just ringing to let you know I've bought half of Seppeltsfield," and he said, "Well, who buys half of Seppeltsfield?" It was sort of unheard of, really, because it is such a grand estate.
Yeah.
But anyway, we got chatting. He got chatting about his vision and his aspirations and plans for Seppeltsfield, and said, "I'd like you to join the team." Mm-hmm. So I did. So it's 8 minutes from home, so that's quite handy. But certainly, you're right. I mean, Seppeltsfield's reputation is, for the wonderful old fortified heritage.
Yeah.
But what we've done there in the last 8 years is revitalise the Gravity Flow Winery.
Okay.
So that was really lying dormant. It was a bit of a museum piece, an interesting building.
I remember seeing it.
To go and look at.
Yep.
Yeah. And now it's fully operational at vintage.
That's fantastic.
So we've got 120 8-tonne open fermenters, and we put about 4,000 tonnes through that winery.
Yep.
Parcels of premium Barossa Shiraz, Grenache, Mataro, Cabernet. Plus, that's where we have a go. If we've had some success with Tempranillo, tried Sangiovese up there. Of course, we've got the Touriga on the property, which makes interesting dry red for blending. So at vintage, it's the heartbeat of the property at vintage.
So if you don't mind me asking, can you just sort of talk a little bit about why Seppeltsfield is such an important historical, winery in the context of Barossa and Australia?
I think my understanding of the Seppelt family is they were great philanthropists, and when Joseph Seppelt and his wife Joanna fled Europe and ended up in South Australia and the Barossa, The story goes that they paid for the passage of 18 other families.
Right.
So there's a huge, that philanthropic part of them. Plus, they're a big family. Unfortunately, Joseph died young, but his eldest son, Benno, took over the business.
Yep.
And him and his wife, who was a local woman, they had 14 surviving children. So a really big family who were philanthropic and entrepreneurial.
Mm-hmm.
So... originally they came from a little town called Walter Prottersdorf, and they were tobacconists and made elixirs. And so, for example, the red cordial in our portfolio that exists today harks back to that part of their history.
Wow.
Yeah. But, so big family, it was a mixed farm, so they tried their hand at, lots of things. They did try to plant tobacco in the Barossa, which didn't really prosper. But they, grew crops, they raised animals, made their own bread. Their fantastic old smokehouse at Seppeltsfield, which hadn't been lit for 85 years, was lit a couple of years ago.
Wow.
When the on-site caterer used it to smoke bacon.
Oh, yum.
It smelt terrific, worked a treat, amazing. So there's all that depth of history. Plus there's really terrific stories, such as during the Depression, the 1920s, when the business, everyone was suffering and couldn't pay all their staff, but for lodgings and one meal per day, Benno kept them on, and that's when the palms were grown and then planted to make that famous avenue of palms.
And which has been used on the label.
Yes. Yeah.
And of course they also had the winery and holdings in what became a part of the Grampians region, but it's Great Western.
Correct. Yes.
And obviously they did great things there, and
of course they also had a winery in Rutherglen as well.
Yes, exactly. So. And that's that kind of fortified part of the business is, I would think, what they're most famous for. When you sort of came on board, had you had a lot of experience with fortified winemaking?
My experience with fortified had been a little bit to do with Tawny.
Okay.
But also VPs in my time at Hardy's.
Right.
Exposure to the Hardy style and the Ranella style.
Yep.
Of VP and Tawny.
Yep.
So I hadn't really had much to do with Apera.
Okay.
Or sherry.
Yep.
So that's been a learning curve.
Yep.
And I hadn't had anything to do with fortified sweet white styles, such as muscat and topake.
So that was a bit of a learning curve?
Yeah, huge learning curve. A lot of it is listening to those around you and taking really good notes. And, then next time you taste, might be 12 months later, you taste that group number again, you check your notes and has the wine evolved or does it need any work, or, you need to do a new bottling blend. There's a lot of record keeping and cross-checking.
And no doubt, part of the reason why Foster's, Treasury Wine Estates, possibly had trouble with it was because of the market for fortified wines, and so no doubt it was a bit of a risk for Warren to buy Seppeltsfield, or to buy 50% in the hopes of rejuvenating the brand. What was the approach as far as the fortifieds when you were brought on? Were you looking to consolidate or expand or revitalise fortified wine market?
Well, we do need to maintain our heritage, and we have seen increase in the percentage sales over the last 8 years.
Right.
Warren also opened the cellar, if you like, and we were selling some parcels of fortified to other Australian winemakers.
Okay.
So there's muskets and other wines bobbing up around the place. So that's been terrific to help build their interest in fortifieds that way as well, by throwing open the cellar.
And were you also, was part of it to kind of make more still wines as well?
Yes, so the table wine range in the cellar door, and the first vintage was 2010.
Yeah.
So that has an Eden Valley Riesling, it has a Barossa Vermentino, which is really great wine.
Sorry. We're being interrupted by two former podcast guests.
We'll let you go on. Sorry, that's Max's fault. He was being
Cheeky.
Oh, that's good. And very importantly, there's a Barossa Shiraz, but perhaps even most importantly, there's a Seppeltsfield Barossa Valley Grenache in the portfolio.
When was the first table wine released? Because I feel like I tasted one. Because I was
under
there.
this new ownership with Killicoon and Warren, 2010.
that was when it was released, or that was the first vintage?
That was the first vintage.
Because I remember visiting with my dad in 2011. It was just before I went overseas, so it was, I think, in September of 2011. I was over in Adelaide for my graduation, and I remember seeing, I seem to remember a white wine, maybe?
Eden Valley Riesling?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I believe there was a Seppeltsfield wine in the show, the Alternative Varieties Wine Show. It was a
Vermentino. Yes. Yep. So that's fruit from one of our growers.
Okay.
So we were really after the Shiraz, and the Vermentino came as another parcel of fruit and has ended up being a fantastic journey. It's a great variety.
Right.
It's one of the varieties that's talked about that perhaps is dealing with changing weather patterns
Sure.
better than others. It doesn't drop its bundle. I love it because it's not an aromatic, it's not a full bodied, it sits right in the middle and just has a lovely salt lick sort of minerality to it. Doesn't need oak. Our style doesn't. We do a more fresh aromatic style rather than a fuller bodied, oak influenced style. But once people try it and really, they can say Vermentino and understand it, it's really popular.
So, is Warren very supportive? Do you have to find a balance between kind of respecting the heritage and, as you said, custodian of the brand, but also are you encouraged to do some experimenting and doing some new things which potentially aren't necessarily part of that sort of Seppeltsfield image, but embracing change?
Well, certainly we have Nero Diavola's been planted on the property.
Really? Okay.
So we've had a couple of goes at that. We haven't decided we've made one good enough to put out yet in a bottle. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely that sense of, which varieties suit, that part of the world, changing weather patterns. There's a lot of thinking going to that sort of thing. So whether it's, the Vermentino from our grower, planting Nero, finding new styles of Grenache. So the last 3 years we've put out a Grenache that's current vintage, no oak.
Wow.
And that's been really successful, getting people's head around that. It's current vintage, there's no oak. It's a really pretty wine, great colour.
Is it kind of in a Nouveau style?
A little bit heavier than Nouveau.
Okay.
Yeah. But it just proves, again, what a versatile variety Grenache is.
Absolutely.
When you think you can make rosé out of it, you can make...
Makes a lot of rosé in Europe.
You can make, commercial type entry-level tawnies. You can make your premium tawnies. You can make sort of a Joven, if you like, fresh, current vintage, no oak. And you can also make oak matured products, big old puncheons or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's a really important variety to the Seppeltsfield story.
Now, I know that when a lot, with winemakers, when they start at a new winery, they're being expected to go out into the market and the trade to talk about, they have to talk about wines that possibly their predecessors have made, and it can be a little bit a daunting prospect. Is it daunting to go out and talk about wines that have been made by about 5 or 6 different winemakers before you?
No, it's not. Because I think, it's a heritage-listed winery. It's a fantastic story. As you said before, it's a huge part of Australian winemaking history. So you're just part of that and you're sharing it. And certainly before myself, James Godfrey was at Seppeltsfield for 35 years. So, you really, I love sharing that with people. It's a man's body of work, looking after those wines and especially, a wine like DP90, that... drier style of tawny with sherry influence. It was very much probably one of the most awarded wines on the Australian wine show circuit. So no, I don't mind to make a history at all. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's fantastic that I can have learnt about it and share it and have tasted the wines. And
now you talked about the importance of the visitor centre, the experience of not just coming to the site, not just tasting, but actually being able to walk through parts of the winery and seeing that history. I personally feel that he's probably the one, or at least one of top 5 most important wine visit experiences that you can have. So I highly recommend people actually take the opportunity, because Barossa, it's not that far from Adelaide, so definitely get out. But as far as other events and tastings, do you know of anything coming up with Seppeltsfield?
Well, next year's the Barossa Vintage Festival.
Okay.
So there's certainly an event at Seppeltsfield in April, I believe. So we've had a series of events called Unearthed. So it's discovering different parts of Seppeltsfield, and so just having like a pop-up event in the Cooper shop, or a pop-up event outside the old Vinegar House. So that's certainly will be happening again for the Barossa Vintage Festival.
Yep.
Similarly, Fino will be doing a food and wine matching event as well for that.
I went to Fino when it was in Wollonga, but I haven't been to Fino in Barossa yet.
Yeah, it's still the same ethos, you know, local produce, food made for sharing.
Yep.
It's great, and so you know,
I have been to fermentation though.
that's pretty.
That's
good too.
awesome.
And that wine list is of biblical proportions.
He loves Grenache too.
Yeah, he does. But even just, you know, at Seppeltsfield, coming to Seppeltsfield and doing the daily heritage tour and tasting the wines. We've also got the jam factory on site, so there's an art component as well.
Great.
To a visit at Seppeltsfield, as well as wine, as well as food, as well as history. Or you could just grab a picnic basket from the kiosk and a glass of wine and sit in our beautiful picnic grounds as well. So
Fantastic.
And kick the footy with the kids. So there's really, you know, something that will appeal to all our visitors.
Absolutely. And if you are aware of them, can you possibly share with the listeners website address and any social media accounts that you'd like to encourage people to follow?
So it's www.seppeltsfield.com.au is the website.
Yep.
And I am sure if you just go onto Instagram, just look up Seppeltsfield, you'll find our
Twitter, Facebook, handle.
Yeah, handle. Thank you.
Look,
but the crew at Seppeltsfield are very active on social media, particularly Instagram and Facebook.
Fantastic. Well, Fiona, I really would like to thank you for your time. I'm very much looking forward to tasting some beautiful old wines today. But I just wanted to show some appreciation for your to sharing your story on the podcast.
Thanks, James. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
And as always, thank you for listening to another episode of the Vincast Wine Podcast. I have been James Scarsbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and I would love for you to follow me on social media. On Instagram and Twitter, I'm at Intrepid Wino, and the podcast is at the Vincast on Twitter. Find me on Facebook, hit that like button to follow me, and check out some of the photos and links that I share on there. And I'd love for you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino, where you can see some of my videos, like my Let's Taste series, opening up Australian wines, and more recently, a series on the Australian Alternative Varieties Wine Show, where Fiona was actually one of the judges. Make sure you like some of the videos and leave some comments for me. I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Player FM, Stitcher, Podbean, any form of different podcast sharing app. Subscribing means you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available, and it's also a great way for you to provide feedback by leaving a 5-star rating and a review. Of course, all the information is available on my website, intrepidwino.com. You can email me at thevincast@gmail.com. Looking forward to bringing you some new episodes very soon, but until then, bye.